Thanks for attending this session. My name is Paul Bradley, and before we get into the details of the role of the OpenAPI in driving API success, and by way of a quick introduction, I thought I'd share a quick story. I was talking to my 20-year-old son the other day about doing this presentation, and among various insults he threw at me, he said, what do you know about any of this? And that actually got me thinking, what is my experience in standards and APIs? And it actually turns out there's quite a bit. So I've spent several decades using and advising on APIs and the associated standards in various roles. But the one that came to mind immediately was one of my earliest positions at a then smallish startup called Netscape, where somehow I got asked to sit on a standards body for an emerging protocol. Now, given this was Netscape, it could have been working with Tim Howes on LDAP or even Brendan Ike on JavaScript, but unfortunately for me, it was neither of these. Welcome to the Web Calendar Access Protocol. My task was actually to try and shoehorn this into the then new Wireless Access Protocol, WAP protocol, for sharing calendar information on the early mobile devices. But I think fortunately for everybody, the quick development of better phones actually made this work unnecessary. But it did get me on the road to using standards and understand what they do, especially within the API space. This slide also has the added benefit of fulfilling the unwritten requirement for all API Days presentations, that there needs to be at least one slide with code on it. But I promise there are no more in this presentation. So back to the presentation. Today I'm going to briefly look at some best practice we have developed at Excelsa for helping organizations take maximum advantage of the opportunities presented by the use of APIs and obtaining value realization, and the particular role that the OpenAPI specification plays, ending up with a recent success story and the practical advice we provided as part of that. A quick spoiler alert here, not something I normally do, but I think it's probably important. The key takeaway we need to think about right now before we get into the presentation is that there is a role for the OpenAPI specification outside of the development team, and breaking down silos of engagement, especially around the OpenAPI specification, is a key to success for any API initiative. So the first question is, what is an API program? In order to explain that, I usually start with this slide from Deloitte and MuleSoft. They run a yearly survey of thousands of organizations on the state of their API and integration initiatives, which includes hundreds of Australian companies. As an ex-MuleSoft employee, I was well trained in how to explain this in terms of needing the right API manager software to successfully implement an API strategy. But there are really two big elephants in the room with this slide. Firstly, while it's unsurprising to most, I think that organizations that implement a company-wide strategy do better than their peers or competitors. The bigger question here is probably, why is that number still so low? It's only 33%. It's not great. And that is for companies that claim they have a company-wide strategy. Also, when we look at this slide, it's purely looking at progress on deployment, so more focused on the technical aspects. No real visibility on the ongoing success of these transformations once the APIs have been put in place and made available. But anecdotally, from our experience, the success numbers then reduce dramatically. Are much lower, even in cases where the companies can even measure success, which again is a small subset. So the implication here is being that whilst a strategy has to be socialized company-wide as a minimum, there's something else that's missing. And from what we've seen, it is, we know what it's not usually. It's not how the APIs have been coded, as this is generally done pretty well. And we also don't really see any correlation with technology choice. So whether you're the vendor of choice for your company for API manager is MuleSoft, Apigee, Kong, Gravity, whatever else, there's no big difference in the success, ultimate success. What we typically see is as the blocker to success is really a lack of a programmatic approach across the entire organization, which is why we developed the API program approach at Excelsa and created our advisory services around that approach. In order to maybe help define that a bit better, what the API program is, let's take a backward step and firstly just remind ourselves what an API strategy is. Now, unfortunately, it probably does mean many things, different things to different organizations. And it's the old joke, if you ask 30 people what an API strategy is, you probably get 35 answers. But at a minimum, it should cover items such as your overall business objectives, your design and development guidelines, governance models, maybe monetization models, and probably some sort of life cycle management or developer ecosystem approach. Now, in reality, what we see with organizations that if a strategy exists at all, it typically just covers a couple of those and not even fully on the individual items. So rather than business objectives, you'll probably typically cover technical objectives. You'll probably get some design standards at a high level, and probably the most in-depth will be which dev tools will be used. Now, two of the biggest misses we see from this sort of strategy approach, even when it's used across the organization, is the inability to adapt to changing business needs and also treating API development as a point-in-time solo activity. Whereas what we see is needed is an approach that enables the organization to focus and track on becoming an API-first organization. So if an API strategy is really about identifying the most effective ways that APIs can help your overall business strategy, it can be challenging to know where to start. To help with this, we recommended taking a programmatic approach, setting up an API program for your organization, whether that's a group within your company or the whole enterprise, and that can help focus, affect, and track the move to an API-led approach. Make it easier, hopefully, to visualize what we mean by an API program, and also for us at Excelsa to develop focused advisory offerings. We developed this blueprint approach. I'm not going to cover each box in detail. You can visit our website to see that, but just probably cover briefly two of the boxes that will be new to many of you. Align the organization is really focused on bridging that gap between the IT and business and ultimately the end consumers, and driving that API as a product mentality across the organization to enable that successful uptake of your API strategy. And then at the other end of the program, engage the value network. Covers what you would expect in terms of evangelism and developer support, but critically, it also forces the organization to consider who their consumers are, because the answer may be different depending on whether it's IT or the business asking the question. And being able to develop a pointed value proposition is key to successful usage, and also key to successful support of what those consumer needs are. So in summary, organizations need to establish an API strategy that is aligned with their overall business goals. They need to address organizational and cultural characteristics. They need to determine the required technological capabilities in that greater context, and ensure that they take an approach that addresses all areas of their API ecosystem. And Excelsa provides advisory services around each of these components. So we've talked a bit about what an API program is, but now let's quickly look at how the specification, such as OpenAPI, really plays its part in that. So any standard, including OpenAPI, needs to be socialized and adopted across the organization to be meaningful. What do we really mean by this? We typically see the biggest miss in organizations when it comes to standards such as OpenAPI is that they are typically dismissed as IT low-level issues and mostly ignored by the rest of the organization. And in fact, the OpenAPI initiative doesn't really help itself in this regard, as it is publicized in a very technical way and really doesn't make it easy for an API product owner or CISO to understand the value proposition of embracing the standard. An API program can help by explicitly including standards as an integral part of the API strategy and explain to the rest of the organization how they can help support the other pillars. So what that means is that in every component of the program that we showed before, each of the 4 pillars, there's really an opportunity to use the OpenAPI concept to assist the customer in reaching that successful outcome. So we'll just cover a few examples to hopefully bring that to life. If you look at it, establish your API strategy, rather than just having a line in your strategy saying that OpenAPI should be adhered to as the way of describing HTTP-based APIs, actually spend time and define what this means and where it doesn't apply, so GraphQL or async, and really allow that holistic strategy to be built. As a follow-on to that, API product owners, when they're building their strategy, can really better identify where cost and time efficiencies can be gained through automating documentation, client code examples, test cases, etc. Now, this has a major impact on the overall business case and the resulting success, as they are items that are often neglected or ended up being dropped or poorly implemented at the end of the project due to lack of budget or resource. If we move across and look at the organization, CISOs can be educated on how to use OpenAPI for helping define a consistent security model across all APIs in collaboration with their API management tools and the network level API security tools, and get that holistic security strategy for risk reduction. IT managers, BAU teams, really benefit from a clear directive, clearly defined directive, to ensure that SIs and other developers within their own organization really build to the same standard, to ensure that consistency across the governance, implementation of meaningful KPIs, and some of those other benefits we highlighted before in terms of automating documentation and code, for example. Finally, if we look at the engage the value network, proper use of OpenAPI again allows the API product owner to not only enable developers to understand what the APIs do through documentation, but also the peer product owners who aren't technical and really looking for the business context. We'll cover that as a practical example later with the customer success story. Just as a final thought on this slide, I think it's important to remember that evangelizing the use of OpenAPI, it's not just about prescribing text in a strategy. It's really explaining that value proposition for those stakeholders that are identified on here. That's the only way that makes it real for them. So based on that, I just want to give some practical examples we did and the advice we provided. And this was from a customer where we recently completed an advisory service. It was a well-known federal agency, who I'm not allowed to name, who had built a set of APIs as part of a B2G program for moving traffic from an existing portal into a machine-to-machine model. And although the APIs were technically fine, the uptake was way below expectation. Our initial assessment of why this customer was not being successful in the adoption and usage of their APIs really highlighted some basic issues around governance and engagement due to their API strategy hadn't really considered who the value network of customers was and didn't appreciate end consumer requirements. They tended to delegate all the technical issues to IT, but also pulled in external SIs for some components and didn't have a consistent governance model across that. And they also didn't budget for any real amount of documentation and developer support tools. So what did we do to help them? What we didn't do was tell them just to add OpenAPI as a line item in their API strategy. We actually worked with the API product owner to define what type of APIs they currently had and were looking to add, and how really a standards-based approach would look. What wasn't important to the product owner, was what the standard was called, but what was very important was detailing the benefits provided and really start to help start that messaging process to the other non-IT stakeholders around consistency and efficiency and the direct impact on these stakeholders. For example, putting that consistent security model for the CISO, or in a way the CISO would understand and could implement into their own security strategy, or the consistent governance model that will allow the budget holder to engage external SIs for new services. As I said, one of the major issues they had with adoption was not really understanding who the end customer was, and therefore not providing targeted support. There was really a general expectation that the consumer was a developer, and in some simple technical documentation was really enough for supporting them. In reality, the first customer engagement or customer contact was usually by a product owner on the consumer side, or even internally in some cases. And they generally didn't understand what the APIs were doing. To that point, most didn't even really understand what an API was. Now, we advise creating a separate business-focused documentation set to help really explain what the digital service was. And this could be done, obviously, via an existing portal, which they had but weren't using very well and didn't really like. Or we provided the alternative approach via the OpenAPI specification, as they weren't really sure actually whether they would keep their portal. And the OpenAPI approach would provide additional flexibility in tooling choices down the track. So even when it came to a developer engaging, what we found was the client base was generally not very IT proficient. And the developer, their end customers, was typically one of those jack of all trades, who's also the general coder, the systems admin, database admin, security expert. And in a lot of cases, this was their first real world use of APIs. So we went through the process of advising the agency on really how to refactor their existing experience APIs. They didn't have to go and do everything up front. We could look at those very lightweight edge APIs first, and refactor them using something like the OpenAPI spec, really to allow to highlight and start planning the evangelism opportunities around that targeted current technical documentation. And importantly, the ability to auto-generate client-side code and examples and testing models, which the customer didn't really have the resource or skill set to do themselves, and was really necessary for those more naive developers. With that, I'll wrap this session up, and also just remind you of that key takeaway I mentioned earlier. There is life beyond the IT team for the OpenAPI specification, and a small amount of focus on it within your API strategy can really yield successful outcomes, both across the organization and your customer base. With that, thank you, and please feel free to email me with any questions.